and I'm really animated, suddenly I stop. Done. My entire body, just my brain turns off, my back is stitching between my shoulders, I can barely move, I'm done. And that was after giving panels for 13 hours.
Yeah, I'm a nerd.
Let my limits, they're not crazy. Don't, everyone here who's under the age of 30, don't turn 30. Everyone here who's over the age of 30, I understand.
He's getting there.
I just turned 30.
So before we go on, I have some pre-show announcement about the emergency exits, which are located at the front, on either side of the stage, and at the back from the doors that you just came through. If you're asked to leave in an evacuation, you will leave in an orderly fashion through the doors behind you and leave down the stairs to the left. Back to you, Chuckles.
I'm getting all like in the zone. You know what? I'm getting in the zone for a particular reason. You know what that particular reason is? I have never done this panel before. Woo! This is completely, 100% totally new. Never presented this before, ever. I literally finished it on Monday. And I came up with the idea for this because last year, after I was done doing Yokai Nation, I discovered all these beautiful ideas and notes and things that just needed to happen. So this panel is a bit of love. This panel is born out of the idea that the one thing that has influenced yokai culture, okay, I'm using the mic, the one thing that has influenced yokai culture more than anything else is art. Art, literature, even in the modern world, things like video games. This is what happens, this is how things have changed, and by the end of here, I'm hoping to have given you enough information about it so you can go out and look for yourself and just see what's out there. Now can the slides go up? All right. This panel would not have happened without the help of three people. One of them is Zach Davison. He works for Drawing Quarterly. He also is the webmaster of KyakuMonogatari.com. He's the guy who translates all of Mizuki Shigeru's work into English. He was invaluable in getting the information on Mizuki. He was invaluable in getting a lot of the information on the different yokai culture trends. Check out his website. He has a book coming out in October on Japanese ghosts. Also, those of you who don't know Matt Alt wrote these. Yokai Nation, Yurei Nation. Yokai Attack and Yurei Attack. He created these books as a way of explaining yokai lore to the West. These were some of the first yokai indexes published in English. Great resources if you're interested in studying yokai or just learning some kooky, funny stories. These are some great resources. Again, big help on it. And Nina Matsumoto, creator of Yokaiden, gave me a magnificent interview while working on this panel. And I incorporated it into her profile slide. So, let's get started with, you're going to see this slide again if you go to Return to Yokai Nation tomorrow. But the idea is, the thing you got to understand about yokai is that there's a different kind of world going on when you look at Japanese culture. We often have this idea talking about the world we live in, the lands beyond, heaven, hell, things like that. It's sort of the same in Japanese, but sort of different. There's three worlds. The secular world, that's the here and now. The spirit world, that's the realm of things like the kami, the ghosts, all those myriad spirits that make Japanese folklore so interesting. And then you have the hidden world. Because the spirit world overlaps onto the secular world. And it does, these little cracks show up. And these cracks are hidden from view. They could be shadows off in the distance. They could be disembodied sounds or lights that you see out of the corner of your eye. They literally can be cracks in the foundation. And out of these cracks, out of this hidden world, things can spring out. A lot of yokai lore, a lot of monster lore is born out of this idea. This idea that the hidden world has power. It's called a conceptual metaphor, giving face to fear. The best way I can explain this to all of you is, have any of you ever gotten lost in a forest? When you get lost in a forest, you're walking among the trees, you don't really know where you are, you don't really know what you're doing. Then you hear this sound coming from behind you. You spin around and you look and you don't see anything there. Then you hear it again over there and you turn around. You don't know what it is. And it becomes scary. That's what giving a face to fear is born out of. The idea of unseen can hurt you. The unseen can have power over you. So what happened with a lot of these was, the show don't tell analogy. When you show the monster, when you give it a face, when you give it a name, you give it traits, it suddenly becomes less scary. You're giving a face to what you're afraid of. And then, and only then, you can cope with it and move past it. I think the best way of talking is the other world of yokai is just one manifestation of a more fundamental longing for something beyond what is immediately visible and available. It's something else, so you can create something around it. Miyazaki has a great way of putting it when he talks about the forest and talks about the power that nature has over the familiar. The familiar, we can walk outside into the streets of Boston and we know generally where we are. We can turn around and say, this is Boylston Street, this is Newberry Street. Why is that guy wearing a dress? It's that time of year again. We can see that world. But the kind of world that gives you fear, the kind of world that evokes this kind of emotion, you never know until you're in it. And when you're in it, it's overwhelmingly powerful. And that power translates into raw emotion. So, it all starts with things like this. This is the Hyakuyaku and Maki. These are actually two different Imakis. The one on the left-hand side is the Kamakura period Maki, and the one on the right-hand side is the Edo period Maki. I took photos of these at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York when they had a big exhibit on wall scrolls. And here's where the yokai started to be cataloged. You would have the names, a lot of people, you'd have folklore going around with storytellers telling these ghostly stories. But around the time of the Edo period, they started drawing them, they started writing them, they started cataloging them as a way of showing these are the things that are out there. The Hyakuyaku was the night procession of 100 demons. And according to legend, it could sometimes be a nice full moon, it could sometimes just be any night the yokai decide they want to have some fun, they go on a parade. And they march through the streets and try to scare people. Over time, it started to become more comical. People started to draw these images. And Hyakuyaku Emaki was sort of a supernatural wanted poster. This is what's out there, don't look at it. Or, if you're an inquisitive child, this is what's out there, take a look for it. And it allowed for creativity to mix in with some kind of, I guess you could say, social control. I don't like using the term social control because it has a whole other can of worms to it. But this was a way of showing people what they weren't supposed to be looking at. Eventually, well, things got interesting. So when you say Edo Japan, what's the first thing that pops into your head when you say Edo Japan? You think about things like samurai. You think about the shogunate. You think about a world where the warrior class is in command, the empire has been somewhat marginalized, and you have people working for the benefit of guys who carry on big swords and whack each other with it. In actuality, Edo Japan was a very different place than the warring states that predated it. It was a period of stability. It was a period of growth. It was a period of curiosity. People, for the first time, especially if you were part of the merchant class or the artisan class or one of the higher classes, you now had time to develop yourself. And there was a whole culture of play. There was a culture of knowledge that came out in Edo Japan. People had disposable income now. A lot of times people were living together in cities and they had ways of alleviating their communal burden. So they decided, let's have some fun with this. And Edo Japan started to build up a sort of art culture around it. So you started to see pictures showing up. You started to see commercial publishing showing up. For one of the first times in Japanese history, you're starting to see a book market. And many of those books were obsessed with the idea of listing things, cataloging things. Because now you have an upwardly mobile population thirsting knowledge, thirsting information, wanting to know more. So publishing companies sprang up to provide it with them. The term was shushigaku, intellectual curiosity, pragmatism, and an investigation of things. It was emphasized that you wanted to learn about this world. It was emphasized that you wanted to learn about the world around you. You weren't going to be content with just, this is what I see, this is what I touch, this is what I have. You were more interested in, I want to know more about my culture. I want to know more about my country. I want to know more about myself. So, things like encyclopedias started popping up. I'm holding one right here. This is the Yokai Encyclopedia, published by Shigeru Mizuki. I'll cover him a little bit later in this presentation. But these books started to pop up, and they were pretty much digest knowledge. You'd have simple entries, occasionally a picture, and a whole lot of information relating to that one topic. People would buy them, and people would eat them up. They were born out of an old Chinese custom. Chinese encyclopedias were imported over to Japan, usually read by the wealthy class. The commoners wanted to read their own, and a guy decided, hey, you know what I'm going to do? This is information that's worth knowing. This is information that the people should have. He published something called Kinmosui, literally translated the collected illustrations to instruct the unenlightened. This was a book for children. And there's, I think, 21 volumes structured meticulously in the old Chinese style. Picture, text, picture, text. And what you would do with these is you give them to your children. Well, first you teach your children to read. Then you give them to your children. And your children would start absorbing the knowledge and absorbing the information. This was the first attempt by a Japanese person to create an encyclopedia. This was written by Japanese, for the benefit of the youth of Japan, so they would grow up knowing more about the world around them than their parents did. This was an example in cross-media. You were starting to see images being tacked alongside text. You started seeing comical little stories being given a breath of life to it. And of course, at this point, you start seeing the first yokai showing up in the indexes. Here we have Mononoke and Kitsune as presented in Kinmosui. The thing about the Kinmosui is, around this time when this book was coming out, these monsters here, they weren't monsters yet. They weren't weird yet. We talk about it in the modern world about Kitsune having the power to take human shape, Mononoke with gigantic testicles that can blow wind in your face. We talk about that now as these supernatural monsters, but when the Kinmosui was out, it was just another part of the natural world that people needed to know about. These are the monsters of our ancestors. These are the things probably in the countryside. So you get a picture, you get a story, a location, maybe a couple of traits to understand about it, but it fostered a healthy curiosity and a creativity in young Japanese people. They liked this stuff. They liked reading about this stuff. They liked researching this stuff. So what did they start doing? They started collecting and wanting to learn more about it. Down the line, the Wakan Sansaizue was published next. This was sort of like someone took the Kinmosui and pumped it up full of steroids. The Kinmosui was written for children. This was written for adults. The Kinmosui was interested in presenting information about the natural world. This, you started seeing supernatural yokai. The yokai were no longer just, this is an animal with some weird kooky powers. With this one, now the yokai were something else. They were something different. I think the single most important contribution was to classify them as monsters. Highlight their beastly natures and classify them as something else. Now, you can see the way they were written. They were obviously meant for different audiences. The Kinmosui, as you can see, this is the same monster. This is a Baku, the dream-eating pig. Same monster depicted two different ways. On the Kinmosui side, it's a giant, beautiful picture written mostly in katakana and hiragana, meant for a young person to read. The Wakan was very academic. I dare say extremely dry. It was written for the purpose of cataloging and classifying and improving knowledge, but not necessarily making it accessible to other people. The Kinmosui was interested in the names. The Wakan was interested in the information. Their presentations were starkly different. But both of them were meaningful because one would introduce the child to the monster, then when the child grew up, well, he could access the other for more information. All of this eventually would feed into ukiyo-e. Anyone here familiar with ukiyo-e? Hopefully. The floating world. Ukiyo-e was a style of art that was born out of the urban boom. You had advances in art, you had advances in theater, you had advances in literature. Ukiyo-e was a way of mixing together these new advances in knowledge with a bit of fun and a bit of creativity. A lot of ukiyo-e prints were based on actors. Actor prints of characters in garish costume. There were a lot of ukiyo-e that was designed around things like views of the capital, natural monsters. These were very popular and they were very affordable. People would buy these, they'd buy the little prints, they'd sell them, they'd trade them. They heralded in an area of disposable income, disposable art, something that you could buy and share with your friends and then pass it on later. They dare say became very popular. And, well, then this guy rolls around. Anyone here the name Toriyama Sekian? No relation to Toriyama Akira, I don't think. But Toriyama Sekian, well, everything we seem to know about yokai can be can be traced back to this dude. Toriyama Sekian was the son of a Buddhist family, Buddhist priest. He himself likely trained as a Buddhist priest. He also liked to draw. He studied the Kano school of print, and he would draw all these beautiful woodcuts and woodblocks, and then at some point, as he was getting older, he got really fascinated with yokai. He got really fascinated with folklore. He would read a lot. He was a very learned, knowledgeable man, and he got very interested in the weird world. So what did he do? He started drawing pictures of yokai, and only yokai. Rather than focus upon creating massive encyclopedias of the world and putting yokai in them, all he wanted to do was show you the monsters. He would create these very simple prints, and then he put 4 books out. They're called the Gazu Hyakyagyo. He would create these very simple prints, again, with the image, with the name, and he would throw them out there for the world to see. Now the thing about Sekian, you need to remember is, Sekian not only knew his folklore, he knew who was going to be reading it. He knew the people. And that became really important because his first couple of books were very, very just picture description. And along the way, he would meet people, they'd talk to him. And they'd tell him about their interest in local folklore, they'd tell him about their interest in other monsters. And Sekian decided, well, you know what? Yokai is all about being creative, it's all about being different, it's all about creating something that's never been done before. So, what did he do? He started creating his own monsters. He was so versed in the idea of yokai as a concept, as that mysterious occurrence, that strange thing, that he would start creating them out of the most random things. He's probably his most famous is the Moku Moku Ren. He puts it over there as the wall scroll with the eyes. He created that part onomatopoeia. The term Moku Moku sort of looks like the eyes themselves, and part is a way of adding something to yokai stories. Something atmospheric, something moving. He would look at the source legend, in this case the legend of the Tsukumogami, the artifact spirit, and he would decide to give it a new form, give it a new shape. And over time, he would start to fill more and more books with this notion, this idea of new monsters. And many of his new monsters became more popular than the ones that came down the line from long ago. Why? Because they were part of a new culture. People could appreciate them as part of a new culture. He never tried to pass them off as real, and no one ever thought of them as real. But they added something new. This wasn't an old story that someone else wrote. This is something that's contemporary. And the fact that it was contemporary made it very powerful. The other thing about his work is it arrived at exactly the right time. Knowledge was changing. How people viewed the world was changing. It was a state of huge flux. He played with his source material. He melted the creativity and the folklore rules. He blurred the lines and came out with something completely different. He wasn't afraid of allowing external influences to impact his work. He welcomed the chance to work with something new. This was a natural evolution of both art and knowledge, and he capitalized on it successfully. To this day, almost every collection of old Japanese books has one of his books in it. I actually saw one. Someone was selling volume 2 of the Gazu Hyakyagyo for $20,000. That much money. These books were that important. His early work might have been matter of fact, but his later work showed the true genius of a man who not only knew his lore, but also his own people. He's rooted in time, rooted in place, but far-reaching to the point where he's influencing people even today. Rather than frame things in the natural world, he allowed them to exist in their own weird world, which is exactly what the people of Japan wanted. They wanted to be challenged, they wanted to be surprised. They were becoming obsessed with this. And that's why his work has staying power. That's why he's able to influence so many future generations. That's why his contributions still stand today. Yokai aren't just natural things meant to be cataloged. They're a mindset that needs to be embraced and advanced. It needs to be evolved. Here's your starting point. But it would keep going. Maruyama Okyo, this guy here is contemporary of Sekian. He's the ghost guy. If Sekian was working with yokai, Okyo was working with ghosts. He also, fun fact, was the first person to ever use nude models. And at the time, that was illegal. He never got arrested for it. In fact, the emperor bought a lot of his prints. But still, he was trying to advance the idea of the ghost and make them a little different. This image here actually is based on a legend that Okyo once drew a picture of a ghostly woman. And when he was done, with painstaking attention to detail, the ghost jumped off the page and flew out of the room. This is the ghost he was drawing. This is Oyuki. And Oyuki is considered to be the first contemporary, the first standardized image of the Yurei. Notice the long unkempt hair. Notice the ghostly pallor with the still beautiful expression. When he painted this picture, it changed the entire perception of what a ghost was. And now, when you see the highly sensualized ghost in Japanese culture, it often comes to things like this. A Yurei is someone, a yokai is something. That is how he approached it. Yokai was some strange thing off in the forest, but a Yurei used to be a person. His focus on the deep visual representation of it, he didn't want to highlight the supernatural denizen in its habitat. He focused more on the plight of the individual and its impact on those around it. That's why ghosts are powerful. That's why ghosts are seen as beautiful or mournful. Unless you get an angry one, but that's for a panel on Sunday night. You guys know Hokusai, don't you? Please tell me you know Hokusai, the Great Wave off Kanagawa, probably one of the most popular images ever to come out of this woodblock print thing. Hokusai, you can say what you want about Hokusai and Hokusai's abilities. Let's be quite frank, we have manga because of this guy. This guy created this simple standardized art system that would eventually become modern manga. You can see it in the way he does the Rokurokubi down there on the lower left, right-hand side. You can see it in his version of the kappa. This very simple to reproduce style that will become all the rage down the line. He only dabbled in yokai. When he dabbled in yokai, oh, did he dabble in yokai. I love his picture over there of the Bura Bura with the ghostly face getting ready to completely disintegrate due to her sorrow. His contributions were unassailable, but when it comes to things like yokai, he didn't change the envelope so much as advance it in his own right. Now, Udamaro was one of Sekien's students, and Udamaro is important for one major reason. He was known for doing two kinds of artwork, blatant pornography, and Yamauba, which at times was blatant pornography. The Yamauba was this ugly mountain hag who would live in the swamps, live up the sides of mountains, and she was known particularly for capturing people and eating them. She was terrifying, an ogre woman without peer. What he did was he decided to portray her as a more maternal figure, and he mixed her up with the legend of the Japanese hero Kitaro, this little red boy over there. And he started to depict her as a mixture of wild energy, sexual desire, and simplistic beauty. He brought her out of the past, took away her monstrous visage, and made it something that we could relate to. He altered the legend enough that it became very popular in the future to depict the Yamauba as this beautiful, wild woman who lived in the forest and was capable of doing wonderful things on top of eating people. But he'll mostly be remembered for that, and well, just Google his name if you want to see some of his other images. Again, Sekien influenced a ton of people. He influenced Utagawa Kuniyoshi, who did that beautiful picture of the Odokuro up there on top, looking at that samurai waiting to eat him. Hiroshige, who did the famous 100 and 165 views of Edo, also decided to show the Kitsune having fun conjuring the foxfire. Ditto for Yoshitoshi creating the Kitsune in its natural habitat, but I would like to point out the two on the very bottom. You recognize them? You know who that is? Take a look. The one in the orange samurai armor with the one-eyed guy peering through the room. You know who that is? That's Samus. People are still using it today. They're using it for Metroid and Castlevania. They're using this kind of artwork to depict something entirely new. If you go online and type in video game ukiyo-e, you'll find tons of those images. This art style, while it was created in Edo, Japan, and was influenced by Edo, Japan, it wasn't confined to Edo, Japan, and to this day you'll find plenty of new things there. So, take a breather. Yes, Frog, those are his notes.
That's a raccoon dog, right?
Yep, that is the tanuki right there, who are known for their gigantic heads. Where do you think they hide? Okay, so after 200 years of Bakufu domination, there's suddenly all these guns and white people pointing in Japan, and the culture decides to change yet again. Now it's time for all those quirky little beasts to find a place in the sun. And oh boy, do they ever find a place in the sun. So, about 1857, Matthew Perry shows up with his black ship, says, hey, we want to trade with you, Japan. Japan says, I don't know. Excuse me, I'm polishing while I polish my guns here. We want to trade with you, Japan. And for the first time, Japanese culture is being exported wholesale to this world. At this point, there was a lot of pressure by the government, both the emperor and the limited control of the shogun, to modernize. Holy crap, modernize. We do not want these people to think we're backwards and try to conquer us. Stop the superstitions, stop all this weird kooky stuff, and start accepting the fact that science is the way of the future. So they started cleaning house. The Bureau of Onmyoji, for centuries, the Bureau of Onmyoji's job was to track down ghosts, track down possession, and get rid of it. You know what? You can't do that anymore. You'll get thrown in jail if you try. Anything that would appear quaint, bizarre, antiquated, or God forbid, backwards, imperial agents, they basically said, no, we have to have rational thought, not as much superstition, except in the case of the emperor's divine heritage. Keeping that, everything else can go home. And things started to change it again. Now, thanks to Western scrutiny, concepts like cryptozoology, concepts like bringing light to the hidden world, things started to change. And it all started with this happy fellow, Inoue Enryo. Inoue Enryo, I guess you could call him the Penn Jillette of the yokai world. He wrote about yokai. He told lots of stories about yokai. He collected yokai indexes. All of them were for one reason and one reason alone, to disprove them. This was a guy who was very interested in Buddhism and the practical application of Buddhism. He believed that Buddhism could change the world if you let it. So what he started to do is apply Buddhist knowledge to some of these old quaint traditions and started just completely throwing them out the window. He created these two terms that were called Shinkai and Kakai, both related around the third term, Fushigi. You guys know the term Fushigi? And I'm not talking about that little ball that you can throw. Fushigi roughly translates as mysterious. And Inoue Enryo was very obsessed with determining true Fushigi from fake Fushigi. So he would go around like Harry Houdini, disproving superstition. This doesn't make any sense, get rid of it. This doesn't make any sense, get rid of it. I'll explain to you why later. But at the same time, he would start emphasizing the things that he found truly mysterious. He was responsible for bringing things like spirit photography, where you get the picture with all those little weird orbs on it. He brought spirit photography over to Japan. He started to look at other Japanese folk practices and ways of reinterpreting them. He debunked fraud mediums and exorcists, and he really wanted to reconcile the weird with the world. If it was truly mysterious, it mattered. He would go so far as to say the goal of Yokai Gaku is not to suppress all mystery, but rather to sort out the Kakai from the Shinkai. Through rational scientific explanation, we can systematically reject the Kakai with recognition of the Shinkai. This is not a guy who said this world didn't exist. This was a guy who said, perhaps we're looking in the wrong place for it. It was very similar to the Western study of wonders, things that are both odd and exotic, but not necessarily supernatural. With Yokai Gaku, Enryo sought to frame the weird world in a context that wasn't really all that strange in the end. And his obsession with separating the weird from the merely exotic would end up driving his studies and lead to a lot of people appreciating the genuinely weird. It was all about quality over quantity when dealing with Enryo's work, and it shows. Now, this guy, anyone hear of his name? Lafcadio Hearn? Wow, no one knows Lafcadio. Wow. I'm starting to feel very old. Lafcadio Hearn was the original weeaboo. That's the best way I can describe this guy. He is the original weeaboo. He started his life as a writer. He used to write these sensationalized murder stories for local newspapers. Then one day he went to the Caribbean, got into a lot of trouble and said, I'm going to Japan. He landed in Japan and, oh my God, I love this country. Holy crap, I'm never leaving. And he didn't. He got so wrapped up in Japanese culture, so wrapped up in Japanese folklore, that he changed his name, married the daughter of a samurai, and started completely exoticizing Japan like it was his full-time job. Oh, wait a minute, it was his full-time job. He was a college professor. He was kind of like me, just Greek. Lafcadio Hearn is the man single-handedly responsible for bringing Eastern culture into the West. Why? Because he couldn't stand Western culture. He couldn't stand the Catholic Church. He couldn't stand so many aspects about Western culture. He looked at Eastern culture through rose-colored shades and said, this is all better than the crap I grew up with. Hey guys, take a look at this stuff. It's better than the crap you have now. Pay attention, it's going to be on the test later. And he ended up bringing to our culture some of its most timeless stories. Who here's heard of the Yuki-onna, the Frost Queen, who glides down the side of a mountain, goes into the house of someone, kisses them softly, and sucks all the heat out of their body? That was him. He took that story, he wrote it down, he transmitted it to the West, and we ate it up. His 1904 book, Kwaidan, was the first example of its kind, taking the ghost stories of Japan, bringing them to this culture, and running with them. Lafcadio Hearn cultivated this healthy interest in the weird of another culture, the exotic aspect of the other culture. His flair for words and skill with prose only served to make the writings even more exotic. They were crazy exotic already. He made them better. They gave them this lasting appeal. You can still buy Kwaidan. I'm pretty sure if you went out to the Prudential Center and walked over to the Barnes & Noble, they probably have a copy of it there.
I own it. It's in their classics section, and I have a copy.
Yeah. I have a copy, you have a copy, you have a copy. Okay. Everyone go get it, it's like $8. Believe me, it's got that Odokoro on the cover. You're gonna love it, especially like earless Hoichi, who decides to sing for spirits and forgets to put the tattoos over his ears and they get ripped off by ghosts. True story. So what did he, in the end, blame it on what you will, blame it on his ambiguous ancestry, blame his mixed race views of the world, but this was a guy who viewed American culture from the ultimate outsider's point of view. He went to Japan, tried to assimilate to it. Assimilated to a point, then got complaining because they didn't really like him, because to the Westerners, he was too Eastern, to the Easterners, he was Western. And he lived in this kind of in-between, where he was looking as an outsider at the culture he was born into and the culture he had adopted. It gave him a very unique insight on how things worked. It gave him a very unique insight on how things proceeded. Well, Lafcadio Hearn's impact to this day is through books like Kwaidan, Kokoro, and In Ghostly Japan. Some of the earliest journalistic-style writings of cultures and practices that we might know today. But he became the prototype for the Western fascination with Japanese culture. As you can see, people write about it. I love the one that says Lafcadio Hearn is almost as Japanese as haiku. Because that was written by a Westerner, but it's true. It is an art form, it is an institution. After he died, he actually was declared a national hero in Japan for his work not only in introducing Western culture to them, but helping spread Eastern culture to the West. And to this day, if you go over to Japan, he is something of a minor celebrity. I think they have a couple statues of him around there, and they talk about him. You can find a lot more of his books there. So, this is the last guy that I'm going to talk about in this particular section because I'm running a little low on time-ish. Yanagita Kunio was an anthropologist. That's one of the reasons why I like him. The job of the anthropologist is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. Yanagita Kunio was one of those guys that could do it. He was a contemporary of Inoue Enrya. They worked at exactly the same time doing very similar types of studies. Whereas Inoue Enrya was obsessed with science and rational thought, the idea that you could use the scientific world to deduce the power of the weird, Yanagita Kunio was more interested in authentic Japan. He was more interested in how to reconcile the different worlds, how to approach seeing Japan's cultural development. He wasn't interested in disproving the legends, but what he wanted to know was how the legends influenced Japanese culture. How were those legends intrinsic to making Japan itself? He was living in a time where Japan's national identity was in a state of crisis. And rather than try to, again, look at an outsider's perception and say, well, we're going to define ourselves to what America says we are, he was more interested in, we should look to our past and come through there. He wrote a book called Tono Monogatari, which was the first in his Minso Kugaku series of native ethnology. The town of Tono was this mythical place that lived somewhere out in the countryside where mankind and monsters coexisted. His town of Tono, his beautiful little town, is where all the legends were true. This is where you could go outside and see a tanuki standing out your door. This is where the Karasu Tengu would fly down in the night and steal your chickens. This was where ghostly people would pass through doors and wail because you forgot them. Tono was his idealized vision of Japan. That was his national identity. And as he wrote the stories in Tono Monogatari, he tried to reconcile how Tono was in fact the world they lived in. Part of his process was this construction of the village, this weird world. Rather than try to modernize the beliefs, as Yanagita Kunio did, kept them static, he kept them rooted in that place and time. He said, rather than lose ourselves to progress, we should take a step back, look at where we came from, and see how that influences us. It makes sense then that Kunio's time would influence how he wrote. He lived in a world on this brink of urbanization. He draws much of his views and philosophies from that dynamic. Cities were the home for the elite, the country was the home for everyone else. And as you read his stories, and you read his work, you start to notice he loved the common man, he loved the nobility, and he loved to show them how they could get along. He loved to show them how they could work together. He didn't believe in exclusivity, he didn't believe in ambiguity. He wanted to make sure that everything worked together smoothly. It's kind of like Western author Snorri Sturluson did when he was writing the Prose Edda. He was looking back at a different place in time, through the haze of today, and finding a way to reconcile the two worlds. Sturluson added Jesus. Yanagita Kunio added a healthy dose of mystery. He also practiced what was called salvage ethnology, which was the idea of preserving Japanese ideals by looking at what they were about to lose and keeping them. It's all about shared cultural heritage. Try not to damage the world as much as possible, but manage to save enough of what you're about to lose so future generations can enjoy it. He didn't want to debunk, he didn't want to disprove, he wanted to contextualize, he wanted to save everything. There's another content creator who was very big in the idea of saving things as well. Kunio argued that they should still the roots be appreciated within context. By discarding them, you're basically throwing away your own culture. And throwing away your own culture is never a good way to approach things. Ultimately, his idealism might have been his greatest flaw and his greatest asset. The Japan he seeks to preserve so diligently is gone. It will never come back. It went away, it was swept away one day. It probably never even existed. That's the problem with idealism. But in some respects, it gives it a home and a memory, and a way to pass things on to your children. That kind of generational knowledge, that kind of, this is who we are. Understand where you come from and then see where you're going. Maybe that's about as authentic as these things can get when you think about it. Maybe that is what he was going for in the first place. But as the time rolled on, and the new world appeared, well, things got a little bit different. I think you got to talk about the idea that in the end, this was a time period where everything was changing. This was a time period in Japan where you were on the brink of something great. One person says, look to the future. One person says, look to the past. One person says, hey, you want to borrow your stuff too. And other people were responsible in disseminating this lore. It doesn't matter if you believe now, it's more than we believed at one time. That belief, that love, is what helped yokai culture survive this period, pass on to the 20th century, and completely change. Time break number 2. Yeah, no, like talking like this hurts my throat. But I love you, that's why I'm doing it. So now we're in the modern world. And you know what the fun part about the modern world is? What do we have in the modern world that we didn't have back then? Television. And now we have new forms of media. These new forms of media would eventually take the monsters to new heights. So now we're in modern Japan. Now that pesky little war is over, industrialization has run its course, and now Japan is kicking into high gear. Now we have to look, you're looking back at their identity and saying, what did we do wrong, and how do we make sure we do not make these same mistakes again? How do we make sure that we found our place in the world, and that we can survive and thrive? The answer? Yokai. The answer is always yokai. Always. Why? Because it's what makes them different. You can't talk about monsters, you can't talk about the modern age, you can't talk about the changing media dynamic of yokai without talking about this guy. Why? Because he's Godzilla. Fun fact, his name is a contraction of the words for whale and gorilla. Gurira and was it Kujira. So you have the whale gorilla. I don't know why it looks like a giant dinosaur, but it's a whale gorilla. Godzilla was born out of a time when Japan was really taking a hard look at itself. It had a couple of atom bombs dropped on it. It was afraid of losing its identity in the face of rampant consumerism. Some people were afraid that nature was going to wake up and start smacking them upside the head one day. Gojira came along to address those fears. Address the fears of the destruction of the Japanese way of life. Address the fears and their anger at what had happened to it about 10 years prior. to address the fears and the worries about nature, identity, and discovering what Japan truly was. This was an example of creating a new monster for a new world. He's not a yokai. He didn't come from that world. They refer to him in the movies as a yokai. They refer to him in the movies as an akuma. They refer to him in the movies as a bakemono. But this was something created specifically for the screen to tell a different kind of story. It's a different interpretation of the same yokai rules. He may not be a yokai, but he follows all of their rules. He reflects the national identity. He's rooted in fear of the unknown. He fixates on that single practice relevant to his context. And he likes to screw with humans. Oh, does he like to screw with humans? So he might be cinematic, it doesn't mean that he's any less deserving of being called a yokai. There's going to be a new Godzilla movie coming out next year. Any of you guys here seen Final Wars, by any chance? Okay, I'm going to tell you the one reason why you have to see Godzilla Final Wars. You guys remember that Matthew Broderick movie from '98? Yeah, that monster fights Godzilla and dies in 32 seconds while Sum 41 is playing in the background. That is the reason you watch Final Wars. Turn the movie off after that, it's nowhere near, actually no, keep watching it, but that is the reason I tell people why they need to watch Final Wars. Okay. You're going to be hearing a lot about this guy this weekend. I know that there's at least 2 panels this weekend that are going to be talking about Mizuki Shigeru, the author of this lovely little yokai index that I have up here. Mizuki Shigeru is the modern day Sekien. He took the same kind of approach that Sekien did. He was born in this rural town, surrounded by ghosts, surrounded by the supernatural. He had people telling him the legends, he absorbed them, he kept them, he loved them. This was a guy who looked at the world and said, I love this little simple world that I came up in, I want to share it with other people. He carves out his own identity through this other time and creates some of the most beloved stories about yokai lore, and monster culture that you'll ever find. Like Kunio, he believed in the power of the past and his desire to preserve and present it. It was his passion, and that's how he goes about doing things. He also writes a lot about yokai culture. He's been publishing published all these essays and journals about the idea of yokai. And the one thing he likes to talk about is the transformative nature. He said, you can't understand the yokai without living for 300 years. Why? Because the yokai context will always change. 1,000 years ago, a tanuki lived in the forest, broke into your house and stole your food. Then it started walking upright a few centuries after that. Then it started beating you upside the head with its testicles a few centuries after that. Then the kitsune came out of the forest and went from a fox that would bring into your house and steal your food and your chickens to something that would bring into your house and eat you. You have to take a look at yokai at its entirety. You have to look at it for what it is. That's what Shigeru talked about. And when you read his books, these are very important ways of analyzing it. Mononoke, which was published last year by Drawn and Quarterly, talks about it. July 1st, Drawn and Quarterly is putting out Gegege no Kitaro, which is his most well-known yokai story about a little yokai boy seeking his place in the world. He was sort of the self-referential Kunio, in addition to being the modern-day Sekien. While Kunio wanted Japan to look at the past and constructing the identity, Mizuki just went and did it. He told stories through the framework of lore and history. He made some much-beloved television shows. Much like Sekien is associated with Ukiyo-e, Mizuki is tied in with media. He's tied in with television. He's tied in with movies. If you want to talk about the modern media, you want to talk about yokai, you're talking about him. I watched Yokai Daisenso on the drawing right up here, the Great Yokai War. He's in that movie. Not only does it take place in his hometown, he's in the movie. He's the great god of the yokai that starts spouting philosophy at the end of the film. He's so well known for using the transformative power of media that it's become synonymous. Mizuki is to the modern world what Sekien was to the ancient world, what Kunio was to the changing times. He draws on his past, he builds new worlds, and you can help the amount of wonder in them. So while you're paying attention to his works, you're understanding not only how he thinks, but how the world functioned when he was there. One of his most well-known creations is the shirime, known as the eyeball butt. He created that specifically because it looked ridiculous. He liked to play with the lore as well. He acts as a medium. He channels one world to the next, translates and negotiating the different realms. He's the link between ancient Japan and modern Japan, between oral and visual, between the then and the now. And oh, he loves it. He loves it because he's still a boy at heart. He's still fascinated by the stories he was told as a child. And as an adult, he keeps bringing that back, he keeps bringing it out. That's why his yokai can be so funny. What's scarier than a dude with no face? The guy with an eyeball on his right. Because both sides can scare you now, not just one. Mizuki is to modern television what Sekien was to encyclopedias, a modern man of the old method. He'll liberate them from the yokai from their confines, bring them into an entirely new world, because that's the important part. The important part is keeping them contemporary. Because as you can find ways of keeping them contemporary, the stories won't end, the knowledge will never die, and new things will be born out of it. You guys know Suzuki, don't you? You gotta know Suzuki. I mean, come on. This was the guy who gave us Astro Boy. This was the guy that gave us some of our most beloved classics of manga. He was the most famous mangaka in all of Japan. He redefined what manga was. While Mizuki was going around writing stories about the war and writing stories about his childhood, he was a guy who was completely changing everything. In 1967, he started publishing Dororo. And Dororo is a modern-day Hyakuyaku. It's the story of a kid named Hyakimaru, literally 100 boy, whose father decided he wanted to gain all this power, so he sold his son's body to 88 demons. And each demon took a different part of the body, an ear, an eye, a nose, a hand, a foot, leaving just this worm-like creature that was his son. He tries to drown him, but it doesn't happen. The baby floats away down the river, is found by a monk, who then builds him a body of his own. He builds him eyes to see with, a nose to smell with. He puts blades into the kid's arms so he can fight. He puts poison and acid into a fake leg so the kid can fight. And then one day the monsters come looking for Hyakimaru. Hyakimaru has to go out on his own. So Hyakimaru travels the world, fighting and killing these demons. And after he kills each demon, another part of his body comes back. On his journey, he meets up with a little boy named Dororo, a little thief, also without a family, trying to find his way in the world. It's at the same time a story about devotion and love between brothers, but it's also a story about self-discovery. It's a quest for the authentic Hyakimaru, much like a lot of yokai are a case for the authenticity of Japanese identity. Dororo is this fat, you can read it in about 3 hours, you can probably buy it from Vertical this weekend. I bought it from Vertical here last time, and it took me a year to read it, but it was worth it. This is a story that shows how Tezuka would interpret the yokai legends and the yokai lore. He makes it far more epic in its context. They're not playful little spirits. These aren't like the cute little yokai you're going to find bumming around the forest. These are true demonic entities that want to destroy and consume and conflagrate. But it's still an interesting story to read, to see the sweeping epic story. Now, how many people here know how big a boner I have for Hayao Miyazaki? Hopefully most of you. You've seen me talk about it before. You've heard me rant and rave about Miyazaki before. I'm gonna try not to do it as much as I usually do. But holy crap, Hayao, you are the man. You know why I like Hayao Miyazaki? Much like everyone else in here, he is a storyteller. First and foremost, this is a guy that likes to tell stories, and yokai are intrinsic to the idea of stories. He likes to talk about solidarity, he likes to talk about identity, he likes to talk about finding your true self and doing something with it. That is what Miyazaki loves. He loves the sacred aspect of the world around you. He loves to see how humans interact with the sacred aspects of the world around him. This is what Miyazaki does. He's not just content to make animation, he is content to create worlds where you can see the old ways and how they relate to the new ones, where you can see the pitfalls of your... Hi, son. Where you can see the pitfalls of what you've done wrong. That's what he does. He shows these two worlds in conflict with each other. He shows that the secret world has face, has character, much like a lot of the yokai. But beyond that, even beyond that, he loves the idea of the hidden concept. The best way is look at that Spirited Away poster. Walking right into the unknown. You have no idea what's on the other side of that tunnel, but you go in anyway. That's Mononoke. That is mystery, true, unbridled mystery, and that is what he embraces. He's He's not so much interested in the individual yokai, he's more interested, I guess, in what Inoue Enrei would probably call Fushi Shinkai, the actual mystery of the world. And that's why when you watch his films, like Mononoke Hime or Spirited Away, you feel like you're running through this world, and you feel like you're part of this world, and your heart will start to beat, and your palms will start to sweat, and you'll wonder about the things that are there, because that's the kind of story he tells. And that is extremely important when looking at the kind of person Miyazaki was. Can't get away without talking about Rumiko Takahashi. You guys know Rumiko Takahashi, right? She created Inuyasha, Ranma 1/2, Urusei Yatsura. Rumiko Takahashi, contemporary of Miyazaki. She's the kind of person who, again, likes to tell stories. She's the kind of person, she's the most successful mangaka in modern Japan. Many mangaka work their entire life to create one landmark series. Do you really think Tite Kubo's going to do anything with Bleach ends? No. Akira Toriyama sort of has two. She has four. Four series that are considered landmarks. She's a national institution in Japan. Her genuine way of working with character interplay, humor, skewed gender roles, all of this is explored as she does her stories. But she also looks at the idea of lore. Urusei Yatsura is one of the best examples of redefining a certain cultural concept that you're going to find. It's all about the Oni, the ogre. These are Oni that come from deep space. They're the ultimate outsider, the ultimate alien. Throughout time, Oni have always been depicted as outsiders. They've always been depicted as from another world. Now they literally get in a spaceship, land on Earth. They want to conquer Earth because they're stronger than us, and they want to fix the problems until they meet a boy. It's always about a boy, isn't it? Sometimes the boy turns into a girl. Sometimes the girl turns into a boy. Sometimes the boy turns into a duck. But it's always about a boy, it's always about a girl, and it's always about things changing. Rumiko doesn't use these things as a setting, but as a system. When she looks at the folklore, she uses it to her heart's content. Like her many definitions of Oni, like her many definitions of Bake Neko, you throw in a Yuki-onna here, maybe you got a luck goddess or two and drop them in there, have the Tanuki make a token appearance, and you have something not based on aliens, but something based on the world you don't see. Something alien in its own right, maybe not in space, but in the world we live in. She gives these monsters, these nightmares, a modern makeover and sends them after hapless students, and the interaction they have is what ends up saving them. These are the same kind of timeless stories. She's building on what the artists have done. She's building on what the creators have done, and she's created something timeless and different. That is just another notch, another interpretation in the wall. I love it. Sure, there are cultural differences in my work. When I see an American comedy, even though the jokes are translated, there's always moments when I feel puzzled and think, Americans will probably laugh at this more. I suppose the same thing must happen with my books. It's inevitable. And yet, that doesn't mean my books can't be enjoyed by English-speaking readers. I feel confident that there's enough substance to them that people of a variety of cultural backgrounds can have a lot of fun with it. And it's true. That's why she's that popular. Who here knows Stan Sakai because of Ninja Turtles? Who here knows Usagi Yojimbo because he showed up in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? Stan Sakai, I met him at Katsucon in 2012. I walked into the dealer's room. He's sitting right there. I walked up to him and fangasmed all over him. I felt really bad about it. But to Stan Sakai's credit, he looked at me and he said, well, it's good to see that you're enthusiastic. Yes, Mr. Usagi, I mean Mr. Sakai. I am very enthusiastic. Stan Sakai's yokai was his 25th anniversary book. This was the book the story he put out after 25 years of writing Usagi Yojimbo. Why did he write Usagi Yojimbo? He was Japanese expatriate. He was living in this country, but he wanted to keep in touch with his Japanese roots. So he created Miyamoto Usagi as a way of looking at the past and the present. Throughout all the stories, we'll find yokai here and there peppered throughout the story. But here's where the yokai takes center stage. And I'm just going to say, if you can find it and read it, it's fun. Because he now puts the yokai in their own context. He starts showing the different stories, playing up the different characters, and Usagi's reactions to meeting up with the monster are priceless. They can't turn around to him going, holy crap, and running in the opposite direction. He's writing it for a Western audience, but he keeps enough of the Eastern mysticism in it where you're going to want to research more. Stan Sakai's yokai is a brilliant introduction. Now here's Nina Matsumoto. I discovered Nina Matsumoto through the manga Yokai. She got her start drawing a Simpsons manga. She did a very manga style of The Simpsons, posted it online one night before going to a party, and by the next day she was famous. Today, she actually draws the official Simpsons comic. Today, she's created books like Yokaiden as a way of showing Japanese monsters to the world. She is Japanese-Canadian. Growing up, this was her way of keeping in touch with her ancestry. This was her way of keeping in touch with her roots. Her friends were into anime, the people around her were into anime, and they looked to her to answer their questions. So she started telling these stories. When she was approached by Del Rey to do an original English language manga, she wrote up a proposal for Yokaiden, and Yokaiden became her book. There are 2 volumes of it available. She's thinking about doing a 3rd. But it's interesting because this is her tribute to her past and a way of spreading the culture out. A lot of people I know have gotten interested in yokai because of Yokai more than almost anything else, because it was a way of telling the story and making it interesting to a Western audience. There's this level of interconnectivity. Here we have Japanese diaspora discovering the lore of heritage, building upon it and sharing it with a new audience. There have been very few Western artists willing to do that. Remember, a lot of the yokai we know come from the translations of stories and legends, but with Sakai and Matsumoto, we have Japanese folk art in the West calling for their peers. It's a new world out there, and everyone's working with it. Watch this on the bus. Best way of explaining Yokai Daisensu is you mix American Gods with the Terminator, and you have this movie. The little boy has to save the world from a bunch of rampaging garbage monsters, Sukumogami, that are trying to destroy it. They're taking the yokai, they're stripping out their souls, mixing with a little bit of rage, attach it to a motorcycle, monster is born, and now a kappa, a river princess, and a kid have to save the world. I'm not going to tell you how it ends, I'm just going to tell you that it's fun. This film was directed by Takeshi Miike. Those of you who don't know his name, he directed Audition. This guy is an Eli Roth of Japan. And he directed this movie specifically so children in the West can have a little bit of fun. It also features cameos by Matt Alt and his wife. I went looking for them yesterday but couldn't find it. I have to watch it again just to see it. So, I recommend you find Yokai Daisenso to enjoy it. You guys know these two? Satoshi Tajiri and Ken Sugimori? We're in the digital age now, my friends and fellow yokai enthusiasts, which bring us to the most influential creators of the past 20 years. Drawing on Mizuki's tales, drawing on his creativity, drawing on his humor, infusing it with a healthy dose of philosophy on monsters in the hidden world, I now present to you 2 names you ought to know both and respect when talking about yokai. You know them? You know these guys? Well, maybe if you don't know them, you definitely know their work. Tajiri and Sugimori are the founders of Game Freak. They're the ones that created Pokemon. And what is Pokemon if not a modern yokai index? The goal of the old encyclopedic method? Take the monster, classify it, write down its traits, write down its stats, give a little piece of lore, move on to the next one. Pokemon, you go into the tall grass, into the hidden world, you catch it, you give it a name, you read its flavor text, you put it in the Pokedex, send the information back to Professor Oak, continue. That's all it is. This obsession with collecting yokai, the yokai character cards of the Edo period, the encyclopedic books of the Edo period and beyond. That is what the pocket monsters are. It draws on the same tradition of collecting, the same obsession that Japan has with catalog, create, and collect. Right here in the palm of your hand. Yes, you do gotta catch them all. All the yokai are waiting for you. Interestingly enough, every single Pokemon on this page is based on some kind of yokai. Be it Salamander, a Jinmenju, a Raikou, or a Pangolin, they're all based on some actual legend. If you guys want to talk about that, you can meet me up and talk with it a little bit later. One more content creator. One more. There's one more guy that I want to introduce you to. Hopefully some of you will recognize him. You guys hear no Zoom? Yeah, there's some. You know what I like about Zoom? Zoom is, again, like Sugimori Sugimori and Tajiri, like Mizuki, like Sekien, like Yanagita Kunio, Zoom creates what he wants. I love his rationale for making games. He couldn't find any that he wants to play, so what does he do? He makes his own. He can't find music he wants to listen to, so what does he do? He makes his own. He apparently drinks more than an Oni, and I find that respectable because I drank a bottle of Sledgehammer last night and got smashed. Zoom is, again, the modern creator in context. He's not too different than your Mizukis or your Sekiens or your Yanagitas. Even though his games are shoot 'em ups that feature lolicon girls blowing up other lolicon girls, he's still creating a different view of what yokai is. I bring this up because now you're looking at the next generation. You're looking at people that are starting to really play with it. Within the context of Toho, the yokai themselves are a little bit human. They're very important, I gotta say, they're cute. But I want to just bring one thing up to you. And this is the one thing that struck me while working this. I don't know much about Toho. I can't stand here and wax philosophical about it. The reason I wanted to put Zoom in here was because of his creation of Toho. Now remember I mentioned before about Yanagita Kunio creating the world of Toho. This world where yokai and man live side by side. The legends are real, the mythology is real. How is that different than Gensokyo? How is Gensokyo a world where shrines have power, where the gods walk among us, where the monsters are waiting to be playful and do their interaction with us? How is Gensokyo that much different than looking at the world found in Toho? They're not. They are the same fundamental creation. One is digital, one is written, but they both manage to accomplish the same thing. In some respects, we get guns, boobs, but also a subconscious learning of the old legends, a kind of academia and healthy curiosity that will introduce people to another kind of lore and give them a method by which they can interact with it. And for that, good sir, I applaud you. This entire panel I've been speaking at length about the contributions of creators to yokai lore. From the playful to the serious, all the people mentioned here have impacted yokai legends in their own way. They've added their own twist and flair to the medium and the monsters. Zoom does it, Sugimori did it. They might not be famous, their work might not even be widely recognized, but they alter and play with their source material on a level far beyond duplicating images and realizing stories. Take the creative angle to heart. They embrace it, and that fact alone is responsible for how these things are displayed. So, my words to you, if you guys want to contribute, all you need to do is look at something and find what makes it so special, find what makes it so mysterious, and just run. Go create something new, because I guarantee you'll have fun. So for more information, I'm constantly expanding on my bibliography. The new one on this, there are two new books on the slide. One is Patrick Drazy's Gathering of Spirits, Japan's ghost story tradition. I draw on it heavily when I do Yokai Nation. Tomorrow night when I do Return to Yokai Nation, I'm going to be talking a bit more about their ghost stories. Noriko Reader's Oni Japanese Demon Lore is now available for free. If you go online and type it in, the University Press has made it available right there for you to download and read. A little dry, but it's interesting to see how yokai lore has evolved and changed. Okay, A.B. Mitford's 47 Ronin, which is Japanese tales of the supernatural and a detailed account of someone committing harakiri, can also be purchased from Barnes & Noble for $7.99. Highly recommended if you want to go out there and enjoy it. So, I want to thank you for putting up with my debut of Mononoke Masters. This was new. I'm going to try and tweak the information a little bit, but I really appreciate all of you who are here listening to me pour my heart out into this microphone and slowly lose my voice at the same time. I have no more panels today, but tomorrow I'm doing Modern Mythology. Oh, it's back and it's even better than ever. I'm doing Shinigami Round 2. I'm doing 2 hours of anime openings. I'm doing a panel on Shinigami Tensei with a friend of mine, and I'm doing Return to Yokai Nation. So, go forth and be happy, people. It's an anime con.